alien girl misbehaves, and the human administers firm discipline, at HFY Sci-Fi Story. The air inside the starship was alive with the hum of engines and the faint flicker of fluorescent lights above. Captain Caleb Sinclair paced down the narrow corridor, his boots clicking against the metallic floor, his gaze sharp and focused. He had been an officer in the United Earth Defense Force for years, and nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this. "She's a handful," he muttered under his breath. At his side was a small, compact console displaying a series of messages, but Caleb's mind was elsewhere, locked on the mission he had been assigned. The diplomat, the alien from a world far beyond human reach, Trixa, a young member of the Krwalki species, was on board. She was an ambassador of sorts, meant to build diplomatic relations between Earth and her people. And yet, she was proving to be more than a little challenging. He rounded the corner, his stern expression softening only slightly as he reached the door to her quarters. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing the alien girl lounging on the bed, legs crossed, her blue skin glistening faintly in the dim light, her eyes, large and glowing an eerie shade of violet, locked onto him. "Captain Sinclair," she purred, her voice a lilting melody, almost teasing. "I was wondering when you'd come visit." Caleb crossed his arms, standing tall. "Trixa, we've discussed this before," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for debate. "You are a guest here, a diplomat. Your behavior has been inappropriate, to say the least." The alien girl smiled coyly, her tail flicking with amusement. "I don't see the problem. I find your human customs quaint, boring, even." "You may find them boring," he replied, stepping into the room, "but there's still the rules aboard this ship. You're not above them, and for the record, sneaking into restricted areas and tampering with the ship's systems? That's a direct violation of protocol." Trixa tilted her head, eyes sparkling with mischief. "You can't expect me to just sit here and play nice. You're far too serious." Her tail swished provocatively as she stood, approaching him with a confident stride. "I think you like it, deep down. You're just as tired of the rules as I am. You'd never admit it. But you want to break them too, don't you?" The captain stood his ground, meeting her gaze unflinchingly. "It's not about breaking rules, it's about respect, something you clearly haven't learned yet." Her eyes narrowed in response, her violet irises flickering with something dangerous. "Respect is earned, not given." "That's true," Caleb replied, a glint of determination in his eyes. "But respect doesn't mean tolerating misbehavior. It means consequences, and that's where you're going to learn." Trixa raised an eyebrow, her tail coiling in an almost predatory fashion. "And just how are you going to enforce that? You humans are so fragile. Surely, you don't think a little punishment will make any difference to me?" Caleb's stance shifted, his demeanor more commanding than ever. "We'll see about that." Without another word, he moved swiftly. In a blur of action, he had grabbed her by the wrist, pulling her firmly across the room and bending her over the bed. Trixa gasped, the sudden move surprising her, but only for a moment. She didn't fight back, though her expression was a mixture of curiosity and defiance. "You can't be serious," she started, but her voice trailed off when Caleb held her firmly in place. "I warned you," he said, his tone unyielding. "And as much as you may think you're invincible, you're going to learn what happens when you push people too far." Caleb was no stranger to discipline, having overseen young recruits during his time in the force. But this was something different. Trixa was far from human. Her species was known for their indestructible hides and their odd ability to regenerate. She was tough, resilient, and unpredictable. Yet, even she would have to learn there were limits, especially on this mission. "You think you're above this," he said, his voice low. "But in my crew's eyes, you're just another member of the team, and as such, you follow the rules, or there are consequences." Trixa stared at him, her breathing shallow. For a brief moment, she seemed caught off guard, perhaps realizing the captain was serious about this. "You'd really go this far?" she murmured. "I have to," he answered simply. "It's not just about you. It's about the safety of the crew and the integrity of the mission." Trixa remained silent for a long moment, her violet eyes glowing faintly in the low light. She considered her options. She was a creature of strength, born from a race of conquerors, but something about Caleb's unyielding command and the cold, Firm consequences seemed to break through her usual confidence. She sighed, the tension slowly easing from her body. Fine, she muttered. You win. This time. Caleb's grip on her wrist loosened, and he helped her stand up. He gave her a hard look before finally nodding. This ship isn't a playground for your amusement, he said, his voice softening just slightly. Learn to respect the rules, Trixa, and there won't be any more issues. Understood? She nodded, still processing the event, the defiance now replaced with something more thoughtful. Understood, Captain. The door slid open once more, and Caleb gave her one final glance before turning to leave. But as he walked away, he couldn't help but wonder if the young alien had learned anything at all. Somehow, he had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time he had to remind her who was in charge. The days following Trix's firm lesson were tense, though she seemed to have fallen into line, at least for now. Caleb could see the subtle changes in her demeanor. She no longer wandered the halls as freely, and her defiant attitude had softened just a bit. But he wasn't naive enough to think it was over. He knew how stubborn she was, how prideful, and how dangerous her alien nature could be if she felt cornered. It was only a matter of time before she tested him again. Caleb was in the command deck of the ship, looking over reports and recalibrating a few of the ship's systems. The crew was bustling with activity as they neared their destination, a neutral station in deep space where Earth and the HFY were to finalize their treaty. But there was something in the air, a subtle unease he couldn't shake. His instincts as a soldier had never let him down before. Just then, his console beeped, alerting him to a new message. He glanced at the screen, but his eyes narrowed when he saw the name. Trixa. The transmission was marked urgent. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck before tapping the screen to accept the message. A few moments passed, and her face appeared on the screen. Her violet eyes were wide, not in mischief, but in something that seemed more genuine. Worry? Fear? Captain, she began, voice tight. I need your help. Caleb raised an eyebrow. What's going on, Trixa? Her gaze flicked nervously from side to side, and she seemed to hesitate before speaking. I've made a mistake. A big one. His posture immediately stiffened. What kind of mistake? I've been trying to access the mainframe, she admitted, her words tumbling out in a rush. I didn't mean to, but I thought I could get a glimpse of some of the human military data. Maybe I could. I don't know. Learn more about your strategies, your weaknesses. I didn't expect it to trigger a security breach. Caleb's heart rate quickened, and his expression hardened. You did what? Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. It's worse than that. The breach. It's opening up our systems to a HFY faction that wants nothing more than to sabotage the treaty. I think they've been waiting for a moment like this. His eyes widened as the weight of the situation hit him. How bad is it? Bad enough. The moment they gain control, they'll have access to everything, the defense systems, the communication networks, everything. They could jeopardize not just the treaty, but everything we've worked for with the HFY. Caleb's mind raced. This wasn't just a diplomatic blunder, it was a full-on security breach that could result in a galactic crisis. The HFY were a fierce species, and even one rogue faction could tear apart years of delicate negotiations. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. All right, he said, voice steady and commanding. Stay where you are, don't touch anything else, and don't try to fix it yourself. I'm on my way. Without another word, he ended the transmission and hit the button to send a quick, coded alert to his security officers. He was already moving, the weight of his duty settling firmly on his shoulders. This wasn't just about discipline anymore. This was about the survival of the entire mission, and the future of human HFY relations. When Caleb arrived at Trix's quarters, he found the door slightly ajar. He pushed it open, his hand resting on the hilt of his sidearm as his sharp eyes scanned the room. Trixa was standing by the console, her posture stiff and nervous. The once playful alien girl was gone, replaced by someone who realized the gravity of what she had done. Captain, she started, her voice barely above a whisper. She seemed smaller now, less confident than before. I didn't mean for this to happen. I thought I could just take a look, learn a little more about you humans. I thought I was being clever. I didn't realize how bad it could get. Caleb's eyes softened for a moment, though his voice was still firm. We don't take security breaches lightly, Trixa. You've put everyone at risk, including yourself. I know, she said quickly, her eyes wide with fear. I'll fix it. Just give me a chance. No. Caleb cut her off, his tone cold but not unkind. You're not touching anything. I need you to stay put while I handle this. Do you understand? She nodded quickly, her tail twitching nervously behind her. She looked genuinely terrified now, realizing just how badly she had miscalculated. The danger wasn't theoretical anymore, it was very real. Caleb turned and moved to the console, quickly accessing the emergency override system. He wasn't the best at tech, but he knew how to get the job done. He began typing in the decryption codes, his fingers moving rapidly across the interface. Captain, please, Trixa said, her voice almost pleading now. I was only trying to. I know what you were trying to do, he interrupted, not looking at her as his concentration remained solely on the task at hand. But this isn't the time for explanations. It's time for action. Minutes passed, but finally, Caleb entered the final code, and the console beeped, confirming the breach had been sealed. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly as he wiped his brow. The immediate danger had passed. The ship's systems were secure, for now. He turned to Trixa, who was standing still, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her eyes were wide, searching for some kind of reassurance. You're lucky, Caleb said after a long pause. This could have been disastrous. I know, she whispered. I'm sorry, Captain. Caleb didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a moment to let the weight of the situation sink in. Then, he stepped forward, his voice surprisingly calm. Listen, Trixa, I get it. You're young, you're curious, but there are rules for a reason, and next time, I won't be as lenient. Trixa nodded, her gaze never leaving the floor. I understand, she said quietly, her voice thick with something between guilt and respect. I won't do it again. Caleb studied her for a long moment. Good, he said, his tone softer than it had been. You're an ambassador, Trixa. You have a responsibility, not just to your people, but to those you're trying to build relationships with. The sooner you learn that, the better off you'll be. For the first time in their interaction, Trixa didn't respond with sarcasm or defiance. Instead, she just nodded quietly, perhaps understanding that her place in this universe wasn't just about being a wild, untamed force, but about earning trust, respect, and the responsibility that came with it. And as Caleb walked out of her quarters, he couldn't help but feel that perhaps, just maybe, she was learning. The next few days aboard the ship were quieter, and Caleb began to notice a subtle shift in Trix's behavior. She was still a little distant and reserved, but she no longer challenged every order or snuck around the ship as she had before. In fact, she had even started to assist the crew with minor tasks, mostly observing rather than engaging directly. She wasn't exactly being friendly, but at least she was cooperating, and that, in Caleb's mind, was a victory. But he knew better than to let his guard down. It was late one evening when Caleb received an encrypted message from the ship's communications officer. The message came through with a high-priority flag. He opened it immediately, his heart sinking when he read the contents. Urgent, unauthorized transmission detected. Potential HFY operative identified within the system. Immediate action required. His mind raced. There was no doubt in his mind what this meant. Someone had found a way to slip past their security measures, and the rogue HFY faction that Trixa had warned him about was already at work. The peace talks could be sabotaged, and this mission could end in disaster. He stood up from his chair quickly, knocking over a cup of coffee in his haste. As he moved toward the door, he grabbed his comm device and opened a direct line to the ship's security chief. Caleb, what's happening? Came the immediate response. I need a full security lockdown, Caleb said, his voice steady but urgent. We've got a HFY operative on board, and I need to know if there's anyone else involved. No one leaves their quarters, no exceptions. The security chief acknowledged the order and began coordinating with the crew. Caleb quickly turned to his next move. There was one person who might know more about the rogue faction that had infiltrated the ship, Trixa. He didn't waste time hesitating. He headed straight for her quarters, the urgency in his steps matching the urgency in his mind. As he approached the door, it slid open with a soft hiss, revealing Trixie standing near the window, her back to him. "Captain," she said without turning around, her voice cautious, "I'm assuming you're not here for a friendly visit." "I wish I were," Caleb said, his voice tight, "but we've got a problem. A big one. We've detected an unauthorized transmission, and we suspect a KRYLK operative has infiltrated the ship." Trixie didn't move, but her posture stiffened. Caleb could see the subtle shift in her body language. She was tense, but he couldn't read whether it was fear or guilt. "Did you know?" Caleb asked, his voice low but edged with the urgency of the situation. "Did you help them get on board?" For a long moment, Trixie didn't answer. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Caleb stood still, waiting, his eyes locked on her. When she finally turned to face him, her expression was unreadable, but there was something dark in her gaze. "No," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "I didn't help them. I didn't know they'd come. But I can help you find them." Caleb's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I know how they think," she explained, stepping closer to him now, her eyes flicking to the door as if to ensure no one was eavesdropping. "The faction that infiltrated your ship. They're not like the KRWLK, you know? They're extremists. They want to see everything burn, humans, the treaty, everything. They won't stop until they've ruined everything you've worked for." Caleb narrowed his eyes, suspicion creeping in. "And you're just telling me this now?" She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "You have no idea how hard it is to watch your own people destroy everything we've worked for. I've been trying to stop them, but they're everywhere. They've corrupted a lot of our own, and they'll stop at nothing to see your people wiped out." "You think they've corrupted one of your own on this ship?" Caleb's voice was sharp. Trix's eyes darkened. "I don't know, but it's possible. They've infiltrated some of the highest levels of power in our own society, using influence and intimidation. I know how they operate. I can help you, but you have to trust me." Caleb studied her for a moment, searching for any signs of deception, but her face remained earnest. He could tell she was telling the truth, or at least, as much of the truth as she could. The desperation in her eyes was genuine. "All right," he said finally, his tone still wary but yielding. "We'll work together, but you stay out of sight until we figure this out. I can't afford another breach on this ship." Trixie nodded, relief washing over her face. "I understand." The next several hours were a blur of tension and movement. Caleb and Trixie worked together, scanning the ship's security logs, searching for any signs of unauthorized activity. They traced the rogue transmission, narrowing it down to a series of encrypted messages sent from a cargo bay on the lower deck. Trix's knowledge of KRWLK culture proved invaluable, helping Caleb spot subtle clues the human crew wouldn't have noticed, details in the encryption, signs of KRWLK handwriting in the code, and even specific timestamps that seemed out of place. By the time they reached the cargo bay, Caleb's heart was pounding in his chest. He had no idea what he'd find, but his instincts told him they were on the verge of something catastrophic. He motioned for the security team to fan out as they reached the bay doors. Trixie was tense beside him, her eyes darting around nervously. "They're here," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can feel them." Caleb nodded, his hand gripping the hilt of his sidearm. He stepped forward, taking the lead, and the doors to the cargo bay opened with a hiss. Inside, a small group of KRWLK operatives was gathered, clearly not expecting anyone. They froze when they saw Caleb and Trixie, their alien eyes narrowing in recognition. "Captain Sinclair," one of them sneered, a deep growl in his voice. "You've ruined everything. This was meant to be the beginning of our new world, and now you've ruined it." Caleb didn't flinch, his eyes narrowing as he took in the situation. "Surrender now, and no one gets hurt." The rogue KRWLK sneered, their hands twitching toward hidden weapons. "Then it seems," Caleb said coldly, his voice unwavering, "that we'll have to do this the hard way." Without another word, the security team rushed in, blasters raised, and the ensuing firefight was brutal but brief. Within minutes, the infiltrators were subdued, and the ship's systems were secured once again. Later, as the crew began to clean up the aftermath, Caleb found himself alone with Trixie in the quiet aftermath of the battle. Her violet eyes, once filled with mischief, now reflected a deep, quiet relief. You did good, Caleb said quietly, his gaze meeting hers. She nodded, her lips pressing together in a tight smile. I never wanted this to happen. I just wanted to help. I didn't know where else to turn. Caleb studied her for a moment, then gave a nod. Well, you did, but I won't forget what you did before. Next time, there won't be a second chance. Trixie didn't argue. She simply nodded in agreement. The days that followed the rogue HFY faction's failed sabotage were tense, but they also marked a turning point for the crew. The ship was back on track, its systems secured, and the treaty talks were still on the horizon. But there was something different now, something Caleb couldn't quite put his finger on. Trixie had proven herself, not just as an ally, but as someone capable of making difficult decisions. Though she was still an enigma to him, she had shown that, when pushed to the right edge, she could be a powerful force for good. It was late one evening when Caleb received another communication from Trixie. He'd been preparing for the next leg of the mission when the message came through. This time, no encrypted messages or alarms, just her name, blinking on the screen. With a deep sigh, he accepted the message. She appeared quickly, standing in her usual position, facing him. This time, her expression wasn't anxious or defensive, but calm, a rare thing for her. Captain, she began, her tone steady but with an undertone of seriousness. I've been thinking. Caleb folded his arms. That's never a good sign. Trixie gave him a slight smirk, but the seriousness remained. You don't trust me. I can see it in your eyes every time we speak. And you're right not to. I haven't exactly earned that trust. Caleb's expression softened just slightly, though he kept his guard up. You're right, but I'll admit, you've surprised me. You're not the reckless troublemaker I thought you were. You did good in the cargo bay. Trixie looked away for a moment, her gaze distant. I didn't do it because I wanted your approval, Captain. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Because the HFY faction, the one I tried to warn you about, they don't care about anything but destruction. They'll stop at nothing to tear down everything we've built. I know, Caleb said, his voice firm, but you know that now, right? This mission, the treaty, it's important, not just to us, but to your people too. There's no future in constant war. Trixie nodded slowly. I know, I see that now, and it's been eating at me for a while. I grew up with a lot of ideals that, to be honest, were just a way to justify fighting, to justify my people's conquests. I've never seen things the way you do. I've never seen peace as something worth fighting for, until now. Caleb leaned against the wall, his arms still crossed. So what does that mean? Are you telling me you're ready to work with us? Or are we still on the edge of another confrontation? Trixie's eyes flicked toward him, and for the first time since he'd met her, there was a depth in her gaze, something that looked like remorse, like she was ready to move beyond the reckless young diplomat he'd first encountered. I want to work with you, Captain. I'm done with the extremism, the bloodshed. I've seen what it does to people. My people. To you. She paused, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper. But I need your help. Caleb raised an eyebrow. Help? With what? Help me stop the faction, she said urgently. They won't stop until they've corrupted every HFY ship in this fleet. They want to take down the treaty, and they'll destroy anything standing in their way. They'll come for you. For Earth. For everyone. You saw what they tried to do before. It's only going to get worse. A cold shiver ran down Caleb's spine. He knew she wasn't wrong. The rogue HFY were more dangerous than he'd ever realized. The peace talks were precarious at best, and this faction threatened to unravel everything. What do you want me to do? Caleb asked, his voice low. Trixie stepped closer to him, her face earnest. I can help you infiltrate their ranks. I know their leaders. I know their methods. But I can't do it alone. Not without you. We need to strike fast before they regroup and plan their next move. We need to get ahead of them. Caleb exhaled slowly, his mind working over the possibilities. This was a high-risk move. If they failed, the treaty would be in ruins, and the HFY could plunge both their worlds into war. But if they succeeded, they would not only save the peace talks, they might even win over the more moderate factions of the HFY. This wasn't just about saving the treaty anymore. This was about protecting a future for both humans and HFY. All right, he said after a long pause, his voice steady and resolute. We do it your way. But you stay in the background. I'm not sending you into their hands again. Trixa didn't argue. She simply nodded. Agreed. I'm not going to risk everything I've worked for. Not now. Not after everything that's happened. Caleb turned to leave, but then he paused, glancing back at her. You know, you've changed, Trixa. A few weeks ago, you wouldn't have said any of this. Her smile was small but genuine. Maybe it took me being the one in the wrong to realize I need to be something more. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparations. Caleb and Trixa worked in secret, coordinating with the security team and setting up a plan to infiltrate the rogue faction's operations. They needed to move quickly, and every step had to be calculated. Trixa's knowledge of HFY politics and military structure gave them an edge, but it also meant they had to tread carefully. One wrong move, and they'd be exposed. On the day they were set to move, Caleb found himself standing in front of the door to the bridge. He took one last look at the ship's crew before stepping through, his mind running over the plan one last time. Trixa was already there, looking out the window, her posture serious, but there was a quiet confidence in her now, something he hadn't seen before. We're ready, she said, turning to face him. Good, Caleb replied. Stay sharp, we've got one shot at this. The air was thick with anticipation as they made their way toward the meeting room where the rogue HFY would be waiting. The crew moved quickly, silently, each of them fully aware of the stakes. Caleb's heart raced as he took the lead, knowing this would either make or break everything they'd worked for. Trixa stepped alongside him, her eyes scanning the hallway as they approached the room. Her presence was no longer a liability, it was an asset. She had earned his trust, and together, they were ready to face the HFY threat head-on. This was their chance to rewrite the future. The door to the meeting room slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a stark, sterile environment. The walls were lined with dark metallic panels, illuminated by dim, ambient lights. Caleb stepped into the room first, his gaze sweeping the space for any sign of danger. Trixa followed closely behind him, her steps deliberate but measured. She didn't flinch, her posture was straight, her expression focused. She was all business now. As they moved deeper into the room, Caleb spotted several figures standing in the shadows, their forms angular and imposing. HFY operatives, just like the ones they had dealt with before. They were dressed in the dark uniforms of the rogue faction, their eyes glowing faintly in the low light. The air in the room felt thick with tension, and Caleb's instincts screamed that this was the moment where everything could either go right or fall apart. One of the operatives stepped forward, his posture relaxed but his eyes narrowing as he locked gazes with Caleb. His voice was deep, almost a growl. Captain Sinclair, he said, his tone thick with disdain, you should have stayed out of our business. This is the end of your piece. Caleb didn't flinch, his hand hovered near his sidearm, ready for whatever came next, but he stayed calm. He could feel Trixa beside him, her presence steady, and that gave him some small measure of confidence. I don't think you fully understand the situation, Caleb replied, his voice unwavering. You're trying to destroy a future for your people. The treaty is a chance for both HFY and humans to thrive together. And you, he motioned to the group in front of him, are throwing it all away for what? Power? Chaos? The operative's lips curled into a cruel smile. You think peace is possible? Your species is weak, Captain. We don't want peace. We want control, and we'll stop at nothing to have it. Your kind is just a stepping stone. Trixa stiffened beside Caleb, but she didn't speak. She merely observed, her eyes flickering between Caleb and the rogue HFY. We'll see about that, Caleb said, his voice cold. You're not going to succeed. Not here. Not now. The rogue operative's smile widened as he stepped back. You're too late. The signal has already been sent. Soon, we'll have the entire fleet under our control, and your peace treaty will burn in the ashes of your failure. Before Caleb could respond, there was a soft click from the corner of the room. One of the operatives moved to activate something, but Trixa was already ahead of him. Her quick reflexes and intimate knowledge of HFY systems allowed her to disable the signal with a swift motion, a series of clicks and beeps reverberating through the room. The rogue operative's eyes narrowed, but he quickly recovered, his hand darting for a weapon holstered at his side. You're too late. This doesn't end here. At that moment, Trixa stepped forward, her voice sharp and commanding. "It does end here." Her eyes locked on the operative, burning with an intensity that Caleb had rarely seen from her. "You may think you control everything, but the HFY are not a people of chaos. You're a faction, a splinter group, and you're going to lose." The operative sneered at her, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Trix's words weren't just empty threats, she was speaking the truth. The truth that even he knew deep down. The HFY were a proud, honorable species. But this faction, these extremists, had lost touch with their roots, believing that destruction and power were the only answers. Caleb's hand moved slowly to his sidearm, but he didn't draw it just yet. There was no need for violence unless absolutely necessary. He would do what was needed to stop this threat, but he wouldn't become the same as them in the process. "We're not here for a fight," Caleb said, his voice low but firm. "We're here to make sure you never get the chance to sabotage this treaty. It's over. You've lost." Trix's eyes flicked toward him for a brief moment, and for the first time, he saw a slight smile tug at the corner of her lips, a smile that spoke of her own resolve. The rogue operative glanced between Caleb and Trixa, weighing his options. He knew they were in a tight spot. He had no idea how much damage the signal had caused, but he had to know they weren't about to let him slip away this time. "We'll see about that," he muttered, but before he could make another move, Trixa had already pressed a button on her wrist device. The air seemed to crackle for a moment, and the rogue operative's expression turned from defiance to shock as his own signal feed was cut off entirely. "You've been outplayed," Trixa said, her voice now laced with finality. "We've shut down your transmission. The fleet is no longer under your control. You're done." The rogue HFY operative's shoulders slumped as realization set in. His faction's plan had failed. The treaty would go forward, and the peace they had been working toward would remain intact. The rogue group had overestimated their power and underestimated the resolve of those who believed in peace. For a long moment, there was only silence in the room. Then, one by one, the other operatives dropped their weapons, their pride giving way to defeat. They had no choice but to surrender. Caleb stepped forward, his voice firm. "You'll be taken into custody. You'll be judged by the laws of the HFY people, just like anyone else." Trixa didn't flinch as she looked at them. Her tone was colder than it had ever been. "You may have lost this battle, but your war is over. I'll make sure the right people hear about this." As Caleb watched the rogue HFY operatives be escorted out of the room, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. This mission had started as a tightrope walk of diplomacy and trust, but with Trix's help, and the strength of his crew, they had managed to stop the rogue faction before it could destroy everything they had worked toward. Trixa turned toward him once the last of the operatives was removed. She was quieter now, the tension of the moment slowly dissipating. "It's over," she said softly, almost to herself. "The HFY are stronger than this. We are stronger than this." Caleb nodded, a rare look of understanding passing between them. "You're right. The treaty is still intact. There's still hope for both of our peoples." Trixa met his gaze, and for the first time, there was no tension between them, only a quiet respect. "I think this is a good beginning, Captain." Caleb gave a small, approving nod. "Yeah, I think it is." They stood there for a moment, surrounded by the remnants of the mission's chaos, but now with a sense of resolution, of victory. The road ahead would be long, filled with its own challenges, but for the first time since meeting Trixa, Caleb truly felt like they were on the same side, working together for something greater than themselves. And for both humans and HFY, that was a future worth fighting for. The days following the operation were filled with a quiet, resolute peace. The rogue HFY faction had been neutralized, and the treaty talks resumed with renewed momentum. The ship was once again humming with activity, but this time there was a sense of unity. The crew, the diplomats, and even the HFY aboard the ship moved with a newfound sense of purpose, knowing that peace had been preserved, not through force, but through cooperation. Caleb spent much of his time on the bridge, ensuring the ship stayed on course for the upcoming summit. But his thoughts often drifted to Trixa. She had played a pivotal role in stopping the rogue faction, and though she was still the HFY ambassador, she had earned a level of trust from him that no one else had. Her transformation from a troublemaker to a valuable ally hadn't been an easy one, but it had been profound. It was late one evening when Caleb received a notification on his comms device. He had just finished a briefing with the crew and was ready to head back to his quarters for some rest when he saw the message. It was from Trixa. "Can we talk?" He hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. He had a good idea what she wanted to discuss, everything that had happened, where things were headed, and perhaps the uneasy relationship they had started to build. After all, they had crossed an important threshold together, but Caleb wasn't entirely sure what he was expecting or whether he was ready for it. He responded quickly. "Where?" "My quarters. 20 minutes. Caleb took a deep breath and made his way to her quarters. The hallways of the ship were quieter than usual, the hum of the engines barely audible as he passed by the crew's living spaces. He reached Trix's door and rang the chime. It opened almost instantly, and she stood there, leaning against the doorframe. "Captain," she greeted him, her voice as calm as ever, but Caleb noticed the subtle edge to her words. She wasn't exactly nervous, but there was something that indicated this conversation was important. "Ambassador," he replied with a slight nod. He stepped inside when she gestured for him to enter. Her quarters were sparsely decorated, with a few personal touches, small trinkets from her home world, some HFY texts, and a few holographic images displayed on the walls. It was a far cry from the pristine, almost sterile quarters the humans aboard the ship occupied. Trixa motioned for Caleb to sit. "Please, have a seat." He nodded and took a seat at the small table, trying to ignore the rising tension in the air. Trixa joined him, sitting across from him, her posture still formal but relaxed. "I wanted to thank you," she said, breaking the silence, "for giving me a chance when I didn't deserve one. I know I've caused you trouble since the moment I stepped on this ship, but you trusted me when it counted. I won't forget that." Caleb didn't speak at first, letting her words sink in. "You've done more than make up for it, Trixa. You've done something a lot of people wouldn't have been able to do. You helped stop a war. That matters." Trixa lowered her gaze for a moment, her fingers tapping lightly on the table. It wasn't just about stopping the war, though. It was about understanding. She looked up, meeting his gaze, her eyes intense but softened. "I wasn't raised to believe in peace. I wasn't taught that cooperation was the answer. I was taught that only strength and dominance mattered. I thought the HFY were the superior species and that we were meant to conquer, not to coexist." Caleb listened intently, his expression neutral, though his thoughts were racing. "And now?" She exhaled deeply, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Now, I realize that the strength I thought we needed, wasn't the kind I thought. It's the kind you've shown. The strength to build, to cooperate, to understand each other. It's hard, Captain. It's harder than any battle I've fought." "I get it," Caleb said softly. "Peace isn't easy, but it's the kind of strength that can last, the kind that matters." Trixa nodded. There was a long pause, and for a moment, the silence between them was comfortable, not awkward. She seemed to be choosing her words carefully. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she continued, "about everything that's happened, about how much I've changed in such a short time, and I want to ask you something." Caleb tilted his head slightly, intrigued. "What is it?" She hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice softer now. "You've trusted me, Captain. You've been patient with me, but I don't know how long I can stay here. My people expect me to return, to continue with the HFY political mission, but I've come to realize that it's not just about politics for me anymore. It's about being part of something bigger, something meaningful." Caleb was silent for a moment, trying to understand the full weight of her words. She wasn't just talking about their mission, he realized. She was talking about herself, her future, her place in all of this. "Are you asking me to stay?" Caleb finally asked, his voice low. Trixa nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving his. "I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if I belong back on HFY soil or if I belong here, among humans, but I can't go back to the way things were. I don't want to." Caleb's heart thudded in his chest as he processed her words. The tension that had been building between them over the past weeks, the uneasy balance of trust and wariness, suddenly seemed to shift. It wasn't just about the mission anymore. There was something deeper here, a connection neither of them had fully acknowledged until now. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes meeting hers. "You've come a long way. Trixa, you've made your choice. It's not just about where you belong. It's about who you want to be. Trixa looked down for a moment, then met his gaze again. I think I want to be someone who helps build this future. Captain, I want to be someone who contributes to this peace, whether I'm by your side or somewhere else. That's what I want. Caleb's chest tightened as he took in her words. He knew this wasn't just about a career or a political position for her anymore. It was about identity, about who she was choosing to be. Finally, he gave her a small smile. Well, then, I think we'll make an excellent team. Trix's eyes softened, and for the first time, there was a quiet, unspoken understanding between them. The past was behind them, and the future was uncertain, but they had both chosen to step into it together. It wasn't just about peace anymore, it was about growing together. Two people from vastly different worlds, learning how to trust, how to cooperate, and how to find common ground in the midst of a galaxy that seemed to want nothing but division. Trixa stood, extending her hand toward him. I'm glad you think so. Caleb stood, accepting her hand in a firm but gentle grip. Me too. But just know, this isn't going to be easy. Peace never is. She smiled, a glint of determination in her eyes. I never thought it would be. And as they stood there, in the quiet of her quarters, the weight of the future before them, Caleb realized that this mission, this journey, was only just beginning. Together, they would build something that lasted, something that would change both their peoples forever.